My mother chose my sister's wedding to remind me that, in her eyes, I was never really family, I was just the one with the penthouse. The ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers, white orchids spilling over gold-trimmed tables, a string quartet playing something soft and expensive near the marble staircase. Champagne flowed like water. My sister Emily stood in the center of it all, radiant in lace and silk, our father beaming beside her as if he had personally arranged the sun to shine through the 20-foot windows of the Palm Beach resort. I should have known something was wrong when my parents asked me to step into a private lounge just off the reception floor. "It will only take a minute, Claire," my father had said, smoothing the front of his tuxedo, his voice tight in that way it gets when he is about to present something that is not a request. My mother followed, her heels sharp against the polished tile. Inside the lounge, away from the laughter and the clinking glasses, my father closed the door. On the small glass table between two velvet chairs sat a leather folder. I recognized it instantly. Legal. Prepared. Waiting. "Emily and Daniel are starting their life together," my mother began, her tone controlled, almost gentle. "They need stability. Something solid." I stayed standing. "They have a house in Coral Gables," I said. "You helped them with the down payment." My father exhaled. "That house is small. Temporary. Your penthouse is different. It's in Manhattan. It's valuable. It could set them up for life." There it was. Clean. Direct. My penthouse. The place I bought at 28 after sleeping on a friend's couch and working 70-hour weeks in commercial real estate. 1,200 square feet of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson. The first deed that ever had only my name on it. "You want me to give them my home," I said, not as a question. "Transfer it," my mother corrected. "As a wedding gift." "You've done well, Claire. You can always buy another." I looked at the folder. Papers already tabbed for signature. My name printed neatly beside a blank line. They had planned this. During the ceremony, while I smiled for photographs and fixed Emily's veil, they were waiting for this moment. "No," I said. "Just that. No shouting. No trembling." My mother's expression hardened as if I had embarrassed her in front of invisible judges. "After everything we've done for you?" she asked. I almost laughed. Student loans I paid myself. My first condo purchased without a cosigner. Business dinners I attended alone while Emily's graduate tuition was covered in full. But I didn't list any of it. I didn't need to. "I built that life," I said quietly. "It isn't up for discussion." The air shifted. My father's jaw tightened. My mother stepped closer, her perfume sharp and floral. In one swift motion, she struck my cheek with her open hand. The sound was small, almost lost beneath the distant music, but in that silent lounge it echoed louder than the orchestra outside. For a second, none of us moved. I tasted nothing but air. I felt the heat bloom under my skin. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply straightened my shoulders and met her eyes. "Enjoy the wedding," I said. I walked back into the ballroom with my head high, the quartet still playing, guests still laughing, my sister still glowing beneath chandeliers. No one stopped me. No one asked why my expression had changed. They saw what they wanted to see. But as I took my seat at the edge of the dance floor, watching my parents toast the golden child, I understood something with absolute clarity: they believed my success belonged to them. They believed my home was theirs to redistribute. And in that moment, under all that glittering light, they made the first mistake of underestimating me. I did not leave the reception right away. That would have given them the satisfaction of calling me dramatic. Instead, I returned to my table, lifted my champagne glass, and listened to the speeches as if nothing had happened. The mark on my cheek cooled quickly beneath the air conditioning, but the clarity in my mind only sharpened. My parents stood near the dance floor greeting guests, smiling with that polished warmth they reserve for people who might be useful one day. To anyone watching, we were a perfectly successful family celebrating a perfectly planned wedding at one of the most exclusive resorts on the Florida coast. No one saw the leather folder tucked back into my father's jacket. No one saw the calculation behind my mother's eyes. I watched them the way I watch a closing negotiation, quietly, carefully, gathering information. My sister floated from table to table in her ivory gown, her new husband's hand resting confidently at the small of her back. Emily had always moved through life like that, as if the floor would steady itself under her no matter what. When she reached me, she kissed the air beside my face. "You disappeared for a minute," she said lightly. "Mom said you were being difficult." I held her gaze. "Did she?" Emily's smile did not falter, but something flickered behind it. Awareness, perhaps. Or expectation. "It is just paperwork," she added. "It would mean so much to us." There it was again. As if my home were a spare room I could simply hand over. As if 12 years of work in Manhattan were interchangeable with sentiment. "Enjoy your night," I told her, the same steady tone I use when declining an unreasonable offer. She studied me for a second longer, then drifted away toward the photographers. I set my glass down and stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the ocean. The air was humid, heavy with salt and the distant sound of waves rolling against the shore. Below, valet attendants lined up luxury cars worth more than most people's annual salaries. I leaned against the railing and let the music from inside blur into the background. They believed I would bend because I always had. I had been the responsible one. The independent one. The one who did not need help. And because I did not need help, they assumed I did not need protection either. But they had miscalculated one thing. They thought the penthouse was my only leverage. They did not realize I had been holding something far more significant for years. 3 months earlier, my father had called me about a bridge loan. A temporary gap in liquidity, he said. A commercial property in West Palm Beach that needed refinancing. He sounded confident, but I could hear the strain under his voice. I agreed to review the documents. I always review documents. That was when I saw the pattern. Lines of credit extended beyond comfort. Investments leveraged against assets already pledged. Quiet transfers between accounts tied to a family trust that I technically managed as co-trustee. They never thought to remove my name because they never imagined I would use it. Standing on that terrace, watching the Atlantic fade into darkness. I understood the timing. The wedding. The sudden urgency. The prepared transfer papers. They were not celebrating stability. They were trying to secure it before something collapsed. And they believed my penthouse could plug the hole. I checked the time on my phone. 8:42 in the evening. In Manhattan, my attorney would still be in the office. I typed a brief message, nothing emotional, just facts. Request an immediate review of trust exposure and confirmation of asset separation. Initiate protective measures. I pressed send. Inside, applause erupted as my parents took the microphone for their toast. I remained on the terrace for a moment longer, listening through the glass as my mother praised family unity and lifelong sacrifice. The irony was almost elegant. When I returned to the ballroom, I did not look at them. I did not need to. I already knew what they were planning. The real question was whether they understood that I had been planning too. The reception ended close to midnight, with sparklers lining the marble steps and guests cheering as Emily and Daniel stepped into a vintage convertible bound for their honeymoon suite. I stood off to the side, hands folded, the ocean wind tugging lightly at the edge of my navy gown. My parents did not look at me as they waved goodbye. They were too busy performing relief, as if a transaction had already been secured. I left without saying goodnight. My flight back to New York departed at 7:30 the next morning. I slept very little. Not because of emotion, but because my mind was organizing facts the way it always does when something does not add up. By the time the plane lifted off the runway, I had outlined 3 possible scenarios for the sudden urgency around my penthouse. The least concerning was simple entitlement. The most concerning involved debt. When I landed at LaGuardia, the air felt sharper than Florida's humidity, cooler and honest. I took a car straight to my building in Tribeca. The lobby attendant greeted me by name, as he has every week for the past 5 years. Familiar. Solid. Mine. Upstairs, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors and the skyline stretched wide beyond the glass walls. 1,200 square feet of quiet proof that I built something without anyone's permission. I set my suitcase down and opened my laptop before I even changed clothes. An email from my attorney waited in my inbox, time-stamped 10:48 the night before. We need to speak today. There are irregularities in the trust distributions your father requested last quarter. I called immediately. His voice was steady, precise. Claire, I reviewed the documentation you forwarded. Your father attempted to leverage a portion of the family trust as collateral for a commercial renovation loan. The request was denied due to insufficient liquidity. I leaned back in my chair, watching a ferry cut across the Hudson below. How insufficient? There was a pause. Significant enough that additional private assets would have been necessary to satisfy lenders. Private assets. My penthouse. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in shock, but in confirmation. Is my property exposed in any way? No, he said firmly. You separated it from shared reporting 3 months ago. However, if you were to voluntarily transfer ownership, it could be used to stabilize their position. Voluntarily. The word carried weight. They had not asked for a sentimental gift. They had tried to secure a bailout. At their daughter's wedding. I thanked him and ended the call. The room felt still, but not heavy. I walked to the window and rested my hand against the glass. Below, taxis moved in orderly chaos, people hurried along sidewalks, the city continuing without regard for anyone's family drama. I thought about the leather folder. The prepared tabs. The timing. They had believed emotion would do what legal authority could not. I turned from the window and opened the secure portal to the trust accounts. Line by line, I reviewed transfers from the past year. Marketing expenses inflated. Consultant fees routed through limited liability companies tied to my father's partnerships. Nothing illegal. Just desperate. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. We need to discuss your behavior last night. Emily is upset. I stared at the screen for a long moment before placing it face down on the counter. Behavior. That was what she called refusing to surrender my home. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and considered the architecture of loyalty. For years, I had been the quiet reinforcement beneath their ambitions. Reliable. Independent. Profitable. They assumed that role would continue indefinitely. But leverage only works when both sides understand the stakes. They had shown theirs. Now it was time to clarify mine. By noon that same day, I had assembled more clarity than my parents had likely expected in a month. Numbers have a way of removing illusion. They do not respond to emotion, guilt, or raised voices. They either balance or they do not. I sat at my dining table overlooking the Hudson with 3 separate reports open on my screen, tracing patterns that had been quietly forming long before the wedding invitation was mailed. My father had always presented himself as conservative with money. Careful. Strategic. But over the past 18 months, that caution had shifted into urgency. Commercial properties purchased at peak valuation. Renovation contracts signed before securing refinancing. Short-term loans stacked in layers like fragile scaffolding. Each decision might have been manageable alone. Together, they formed pressure. And pressure seeks relief. I thought about the way my mother had framed it in the lounge. Stability. Family support. Words designed to sound noble. Not once had she mentioned liquidity gaps or leveraged equity. They had counted on the setting to carry the weight of their request. A wedding. A celebration. An atmosphere where refusal would feel selfish. I closed the reports and opened a secure document folder labeled Bennett Family Trust. My name appeared beside my father's as co-trustee, a detail he once described as symbolic. A formality. Something to make me feel included. I doubt he ever imagined I would treat it as responsibility. I reviewed the clauses governing discretionary distributions. Any major asset transfer required unanimous trustee approval. Any extraordinary liquidation triggered mandatory disclosure to beneficiaries. Emily was a beneficiary. So was I. If they had succeeded in persuading me to sign over my penthouse privately, they could have used it as collateral without alerting the broader trust structure. Clean. Quiet. Efficient. I leaned back in my chair and let the realization settle fully. They did not want to celebrate Emily's new life. They wanted to ensure their own. My phone vibrated again. This time it was my father. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. His voice was measured, almost cordial. "Claire, your mother feels that last night escalated unnecessarily." I walked to the window, watching a barge move slowly downriver. "Last night clarified things," I said. A brief silence followed. "You have done well for yourself," he continued. "We are proud of that. But family. Wealth should function collectively. It is inefficient to let assets sit idle." Idle. I looked around at the space I had built, the framed degrees on the wall, the floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with contracts and closing binders. "My home is not idle," I replied. "It is mine." His tone cooled slightly. "Your success was built on opportunity we provided." I considered that statement carefully. Tuition support ended when I chose real estate instead of law. My first brokerage license was paid for with savings from waiting tables. The only opportunity consistently provided was comparison to my sister. "If you are calling to revisit the transfer," I said evenly, "the answer remains no." He exhaled through his nose. "Then understand that consequences follow stubbornness." I almost smiled at the symmetry of that phrase. "They do," I agreed. "For everyone." I ended the call before he could respond. I stood still for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Consequences. He believed he was warning me. What he did not understand was that I had already begun calculating them. I returned to my laptop and drafted a formal notice to the trust's accounting firm requesting a comprehensive audit of all recent leveraged positions. Transparent. Documented. Procedural. No drama. Just process. If they wanted to frame this as family unity, then it would unfold within legal clarity. I pressed send and closed the computer. The sunlight had shifted across the floor, stretching long toward the entryway. My cheek no longer held any trace of warmth from the night before. Only memory. And memory, unlike emotion, can be organized into strategy. They had believed the moment would intimidate me into compliance. Instead, it had given me proof. Proof of urgency. Proof of risk. Proof that the penthouse was never about Emily. It was about survival. And survival, I understood very well. The audit request moved faster than I expected. By late afternoon, the accounting firm confirmed receipt and scheduled a preliminary review for the next morning. Formal language. Polite efficiency. No hint of alarm in their tone, which meant one thing. They had seen situations like this before. I stood in my kitchen, the city glowing gold beyond the windows, and realized how quietly power shifts when documentation replaces assumption. At 6:15 in the evening, Emily called. Her voice sounded lighter than it had at the wedding, but there was an edge beneath it, like someone trying to keep balance on an uneven floor. Mom said you are creating unnecessary tension, she began. I poured a glass of sparkling water and leaned against the counter. I am creating transparency, I replied. A pause followed. You embarrassed them, she said. At my own wedding. I closed my eyes for a moment, not from guilt, but from recognition. The narrative had already been rewritten. I was no longer the daughter who refused to give away her home. I was the sister who disrupted a celebration. Emily, I said carefully, did they tell you why they needed the penthouse? Silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. Just silence. They said it would be safer in your name, she answered finally. Safer from what? I asked the question gently, but directly. Another pause, longer this time. The market, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I let the quiet stretch between us. Outside, a helicopter passed over the river, its low hum fading into the distance. If they were fully stable, I said, they would not need my asset to create safety. I could almost hear her mind recalibrating. Emily had always trusted the version of reality handed to her. It required less friction that way. Are you saying they are in trouble? The word trouble sounded foreign on her tongue. I am saying numbers do not panic, I replied. People do. She exhaled softly. Daniel mentioned something about refinancing delays, she admitted. Dad brushed it off. I nodded to myself. Refinancing delays rarely exist in isolation. You deserve to start your marriage without hidden weight, I said. That includes debt you did not create. The line went quiet again. Then, more quietly than before, she asked, did you really file something with the accountants? I requested clarity, I said. As trustee, that is my responsibility. There was a subtle shift in her tone, less defensive, more uncertain. Mom is going to be furious. I looked around my apartment, at the skyline turning indigo as evening settled. Fury had already been spent. Now came exposure. Anger does not change arithmetic, I said. We ended the call without resolution, but something important had moved. Not agreement. Awareness. After I set my phone down, I opened my calendar and blocked the next 2 days. Meetings rescheduled. Calls postponed. I wanted space to watch this unfold without distraction. My parents believed control was maintained through pressure and performance. They had used a ballroom. I would use paper. As darkness settled over Manhattan, lights flickered on across neighboring buildings, each window framing a different private story. I thought about the leather folder again, the neat tabs prepared for my signature. They had counted on speed. On spectacle. On the assumption that I would not resist in public. They had misjudged both my restraint and my memory. I remembered every conversation about collective wealth. Every subtle comparison to Emily's softer path. Every moment I was praised for being strong enough not to need support. Strength, I had learned, is often admired most when it is convenient. Now it was inconvenient. And that changed everything. The audit meeting began at 9 sharp the next morning, a video call with 3 faces arranged in neat rectangles across my screen. Their expressions were neutral, professional, the kind that do not reveal concern until it is formally documented. I sat at my dining table with the skyline behind me and a legal pad open at my side. I did not intend to interrupt. I intended to listen. The senior accountant began by outlining the trust's current structure, reciting asset allocations and liabilities with calm precision. Then he paused. There has been an increase in leveraged exposure tied to commercial redevelopment projects over the past 4 quarters, he said. Specifically, the West Palm Beach property. I wrote the address down even though I already knew it. The refinancing attempt was declined due to valuation concerns and insufficient coverage, he continued. As co-trustee, you are authorized to request collateral supplementation. However, any significant private asset introduced into the trust would alter beneficiary ratios. There it was. Clean. Undeniable. If I transferred my penthouse, it would not simply stabilize my father's position. It would shift long-term equity. Permanently. Is the trust currently at risk of default? I asked. No emotion. Just information. The answer came carefully. Not immediately. However, without restructuring or external liquidity, pressure will increase within 6 to 8 months. 6 to 8 months. The wedding had been timed almost perfectly. A public celebration before private strain surfaced. Thank you, I said. Please proceed with a full exposure assessment and circulate findings to all trustees and beneficiaries. There was a subtle tightening in their expressions. Transparency changes tone. Understood. The senior accountant replied. The call ended at 9:47. I remained seated for a few moments, absorbing the quiet of my apartment. Outside, the city moved without hesitation. Inside, a narrative was collapsing. At 10:15, my father called again. This time, I answered immediately. You contacted the accountants, he said without greeting. Yes, I replied. As trustee, I am obligated to. His breath came through the line heavier than usual. You have turned a family matter into a formal review. I looked at the river below, sunlight scattering across its surface. You turned it into a financial maneuver at a wedding. Silence followed, thick and restrained. We were protecting what we built, he said finally. By asking me to surrender what I built, I answered. He did not deny it. Instead, he shifted. If the review goes out to beneficiaries, Emily will panic. I considered that. Panic thrives in secrecy. Clarity often reduces it. Emily deserves accurate information, I said. So do I. His voice lowered. You are risking reputation. The word lingered between us. Reputation. The invisible currency my parents valued above liquidity. I allowed a brief pause before responding. Reputation is sustained by solvency, I said calmly. Not performance. He ended the call without another word. I placed my phone on the table and felt something unfamiliar but steady settle inside me. Not anger. Not triumph. Alignment. For years, I had operated in parallel to my family's financial ecosystem, separate but adjacent. Now the lines intersected clearly. They had hoped pressure would drive compliance. Instead, it triggered procedure. I opened my email and found a message from Emily. It was shorter than our call the night before. Daniel reviewed some documents. Can we talk tonight? I read it twice. There was no accusation in the words. Only uncertainty. I typed back a simple confirmation and closed my laptop. The afternoon light had shifted again, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I walked to the window and pressed my hand lightly against the glass. Below, a delivery truck double-parked, traffic adjusting around it with brief annoyance before flowing forward again. Systems adapt when obstacles appear. They do not collapse immediately. They reroute. My parents had believed the obstacle was my refusal. They did not realize the obstacle was arithmetic. And arithmetic does not respond to guilt, nostalgia, or raised voices. It responds to structure. They had tried to use spectacle. I had chosen structure. And structure, once activated, does not retreat quietly. Emily called that evening at 8:12. The sky outside my windows had turned a deep shade of blue, the city lights reflecting against the river like scattered coins. I answered on the second ring. Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the confidence she carried at the wedding. Daniel looked over the numbers you mentioned, she began. He asked Dad for details. Dad said it was temporary cash flow. I walked slowly across my living room, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing on the line. Temporary issues do not require permanent asset transfers, I said. She did not argue. That was new. Daniel works in private equity, she continued. He said if refinancing was denied, the leverage ratio must be high. I stopped near the window and looked down at the traffic 30 stories below. It is, I replied. And adding my property would not fix the structure. It would only delay consequences. There was a faint tremor in her voice when she spoke next. Why would they not just tell us? The question lingered. I thought about our childhood dining table, about the way financial discussions were always framed as strategy rather than risk. Because telling you would change the image, I said gently. An image has always mattered. She was silent for a long moment. I imagined her sitting in a hotel suite somewhere along the Florida coast, wedding gifts still stacked unopened against a wall. Mom said you overreacted, she said finally. She said you embarrassed her. I let out a slow breath. Emily, they asked me to surrender the only property fully in my name. At your reception. That is not a misunderstanding. That is planning. The words seemed to settle into her awareness. Planning. Not emotion. Not impulse. Daniel thinks we should see everything before we make any decisions, she said. He asked if you would share what you have. I felt something shift inside me then. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Just alignment expanding beyond myself. I will forward the audit summary once it is finalized, I said. You deserve full visibility. Her tone softened. I did not know, she admitted quietly. About the trust. About the leverage. I believed her. Emily had been shielded by design. Protection can look like privilege from the outside, but it often functions as insulation from reality. You are not responsible for decisions you were not shown, I told her. She exhaled, long and unsteady. Mom is going to say you are dividing us. I watched a taxi turn sharply at the intersection below, brake lights flashing red before merging smoothly back into motion. Transparency does not divide, I said. It clarifies. After we ended the call, I stood alone in the dim light of my apartment. My phone remained silent. No new messages from my parents. No formal objections yet from the trust. Just stillness. I walked to my desk and opened the preliminary audit notes that had arrived late that afternoon. The language was measured but unmistakable. Concentrated exposure. Overextended credit. Collateral dependency. Words that describe pressure without theatrics. I closed the document and rested my palms flat against the desk. They had believed the confrontation would isolate me. That I would retreat from scrutiny to preserve harmony. Instead, the scrutiny was expanding. Daniel would ask questions. Emily would expect answers. Beneficiaries would receive disclosures. The narrative of unity was already shifting toward accountability. I turned off the lights in my living room and let the city glow fill the space. The penthouse stood exactly as it had the night before the wedding. Solid. Unmoved. Mine. But something else had changed. The leverage they tried to claim had inverted. They no longer held the advantage of secrecy. And without secrecy, pressure has nowhere to hide. The full audit summary arrived 48 hours later in a secure encrypted file that required two-factor authentication to open. I reviewed it at my dining table just after sunrise, the city still quiet beneath a pale gray sky. The numbers were no longer abstract projections. They were defined. The West Palm Beach redevelopment was overleveraged by a margin that would concern any institutional lender. Secondary lines of credit had been extended against projected occupancy rates that had not materialized. Consultant fees were tied to affiliated entities, creating circular obligations that looked stable only on paper. The conclusion was clear without dramatics. Without asset restructuring or external capital injection, liquidity pressure would intensify within the year. I closed the document and stared out at the river for a long moment. They had not miscalculated slightly. They had miscalculated fundamentally. At 10:23, my inbox chimed again. The accounting firm had circulated the summary to all trustees and beneficiaries as required. Emily and I were copied. My father and mother were included. There was no editorial tone in the email. Just documentation. Transparency is rarely loud, but it travels quickly. 30 minutes later, my phone lit up with back-to-back calls from both of my parents. I let them ring. Not out of spite, but out of control. Reaction would only feed narrative. Structure would dismantle it. Instead of answering, I forwarded the audit summary to Daniel with a brief note, for your independent review. No commentary. No accusation. At 11:15, Emily sent a message. I did not realize it was this severe. Daniel wants a meeting with everyone. I read the words twice. Severe. The word carried more weight than trouble ever could. It implied scale. At noon, I received a voicemail from my father. His voice was no longer measured. You have forced this into the open, he said. You have jeopardized relationships that matter. I listened once, then archived it. Relationships that matter. I considered that phrase carefully. If a relationship depends on concealment to survive, it is already fractured. My laptop chimed with a calendar invitation. Family Trust Review. Friday at 3 p.m. Virtual attendance mandatory. The accounting firm had scheduled it. Not my father. Not my mother. Process had overtaken performance. I stood and walked slowly through my apartment, sunlight now bright against the hardwood floors. Every step echoed lightly in the open space. They had believed speed would corner me. That urgency at a wedding would produce compliance. Instead, time had widened the frame. Questions were multiplying beyond my control, but not beyond clarity. At 2:30, Daniel called directly. His tone was analytical, not emotional. Claire, I have reviewed the summary, he said. The leverage ratio is unsustainable without substantial collateral. Were you aware of this before the wedding? I paused briefly. I suspected exposure, I replied. Not full scale. He was quiet for a moment. They intended to use your property as supplemental collateral, he said, not as a question. Yes. Another pause. Without disclosure. Yes. He exhaled slowly. That would have altered beneficiary positions long term. Yes. There was no accusation in his voice. Only confirmation. This needs correction, he said. Structurally. I agreed. After we ended the call, I returned to the window. The river moved steadily. Indifferent to individual crises. I placed my hand against the cool glass and allowed the moment to settle. My cheek no longer remembered the sting from the lounge. My body no longer carried any trace of that instant. But the consequence of that gesture had expanded far beyond what they anticipated. They had attempted to apply pressure in private and prestige in public. Now both were dissolving under documentation. The penthouse remained unchanged. The skyline remained expansive. But the leverage had inverted completely. They no longer controlled the story. The numbers did. And numbers, once released, do not retreat back into silence. The Family Trust Review began exactly at 3 p.m. on Friday. 4 squares appeared on my screen first, then a fifth as the senior accountant joined. My father sat rigidly in his home office in Palm Beach, framed by dark wood shelves and carefully arranged awards. My mother sat beside him, posture straight, expression composed but tight around the eyes. Emily appeared from what looked like a hotel conference room, Daniel seated next to her, his laptop open and a legal pad already filled with notes. I remained at my dining table in Manhattan, sunlight stretching across the floor behind me. The accountant spoke first, summarizing the audit in neutral language that left little room for reinterpretation. Exposure levels. Refinancing denial. Collateral dependency. Each phrase landed without drama, but with weight. When he finished, silence followed. My father cleared his throat. We had intended to resolve this internally, he began. There was no reason to escalate. Daniel responded before I could. His tone was calm, controlled. With respect, internal resolution would have required undisclosed collateral from Claire. That is not resolution. That is redistribution. My mother shifted slightly in her chair. It was a temporary safeguard, she insisted. Families support one another. I watched their faces carefully, not searching for weakness, but for acknowledgement. Support requires consent and transparency, I said. Neither were present. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment before lifting her gaze. You should have told us, she said softly. It was not accusation. It was recognition. My father's composure faltered briefly. The market shifted unexpectedly, he replied. We protected you from unnecessary concern. I understood that instinct. Protect the image. Preserve the illusion of control. But protection built on concealment eventually fractures. The accountant interjected gently. The trust must now consider restructuring. Options. Asset sales, capital injection, or strategic liquidation. The word liquidation lingered in the air like a quiet alarm. I felt no surge of triumph. Only clarity. My property is not available for collateralization, I stated. However, I am willing to discuss structured solutions that preserve equity without unilateral sacrifice. Daniel nodded slightly. Emily's shoulders eased by a fraction. My father stared at the desk in front of him. For the first time, he looked less like a strategist and more like a man confronting arithmetic. The meeting lasted 48 minutes. By the end, a formal restructuring committee had been agreed upon. Independent advisors would assess property valuation. Non-essential holdings would be reviewed for sale. No single beneficiary would absorb disproportionate exposure. When the call ended, the screen went dark, leaving only my reflection faintly visible against the city skyline. I sat there for a while, letting the silence settle fully. My phone remained still. No immediate backlash. No dramatic declarations. Just process unfolding as it should have from the beginning. I stood and walked toward the windows. The Hudson moved steadily below, sunlight glinting off its surface. 1,200 square feet of quiet strength surrounded me. The penthouse had never been just real estate. It was proof that I could build something without dependency. They had tried to convert it into a solution for their miscalculation. Instead, it became the line that clarified everything. Later that evening, Emily sent a short message. Thank you for not letting this stay hidden. I read it twice before setting the phone aside. This was not revenge in the way my parents might define it. There were no raised voices left. No public scenes. Only exposure, documentation, and consequence. They wanted my penthouse. What they lost instead was the assumption that I would surrender myself to preserve their comfort. And that shift, quiet and irreversible, was worth far more than any square footage.